I believe in impossible things as the way to make them possible. How about you? Many of you may recall this speech from Ignacio, the famous opening of the Istanbul GFMD 2 years ago. And it is tomorrow that Ignacio has his last day as Secretary General of Terre Des Hommes. And it is... right. And for me as a member of the Presidential Board of Terre Des Hommes Germany, for us as Terre Des Hommes family, but for all of us here in the room, we have a lot to appreciate and thank Ignacio for. A large portion of what we have here today is thanks to the tireless work Ignacio has put into this as working for Terre Des Hommes for 17 years. And we have something prepared because, as many of you know, perhaps you could help me with that. Ignacio is going to take off to Croatia in 2 days in the morning for 1,250 kilometers in 9 days for the 9 recommended principles for children on the move. And we have prepared something. We know you can't take a lot of luggage on that journey, but what you can use perhaps is a small t-shirt which has been signed by many of you in the room here and says, Ignacio, you're our number one, and that's our present to you. Thank you.
Bravo. Muchas gracias. Gracias, Joshua.
Thank you very much, Joshua. Now we are going to show a short video. It lasts just a couple of minutes, and it's about the work that Ignacio has carried out. Ignacio, do you want to...
We had here in Berlin a global conference on children on the move. This was organized by an initiative of 27 organizations, many in the room. It was a key moment to listen to voices, and for the preparation of that, there were country consultations with children. There was also a regional conference in Southeast Asia. This conference had many objectives, one of, amongst others, to focus on the global compacts, but not only about that, because it's not only about the global compacts. It's about solutions, it's about what next. It's about also giving voice to children and giving voice to youth. And Milena, who's the Child Rights Rapporteur, is one of the people who's coming out of this global conference. You know, she's under 18. You know, after 10 years, at last, we have someone under 18 amongst us. Eh? At the Civil Society Days of the GFMD 2015, where I had the privilege of being the chair, that's when we asked how many youth in the room, and there were 5 hands. Carl, no, you weren't youth. Carl Christensen, who's there, was the 20-year-old who was the Child Rights Rapporteur in Istanbul. This year we have many more, and that comes from the Global Conference on Children on the Move, where youth have taken an important role. We have here youth who have migration experience, whether they be Hamza, whether we will have Farah tomorrow. I'm sorry, I'm just forgetting the list. Milena, of course, Marianne, Anas, many. That is important that we are also listening to the voices of the people who would be managing a lot in 20 years' time, as we were talking about a long-term perspective. And I think the film also illustrates a little bit what we lived during those days, which has been quite a long process too.
Gracias, Ignacio.
Thank you, Ignacio. Can we show the video, please?
El audio.
Isn't he handsome?
¿Alguien nos puede ayudar con el audio? Por favor.
Can someone help us with the technical problem with audio, with sound?
Bueno, una disculpa porque no.
My apologies. There's a technical problem, so we couldn't hear the sound. Maybe we can find that time, a moment to listen to it afterwards. Now we are going to give the floor to Michele, Gibril, and Ignacio, so that they can speak at the Global Compact. There will be time for questions in order to see what our doubts on this regard are. We are going to give the floor to Ignacio so that he can speak about his work on children and the special report that was published in September.
Yes, I'd like to report back from things that we discussed as civil society in preparation to the New York Declaration and then the GFMD 2016 in Dhaka. And I would like to go back to a civil society meeting, which was a satellite meeting of the GFMD in Cyprus, 30th of September 2016, 1st of October 2016. In there with youth, with practitioners, and some of you as advocates, as more policy people. We said, there's such a confusion around this New York Declaration. We don't understand. I didn't hear very much different just now, by the way. We said, this is a great opportunity. If they don't know, let's shape it. Let's move on. Let's show our energy. Let's see if we can take over the space which is there. We also said, well, let's take the New York Declaration, 6 areas concerning children. Let's develop them. But not forgetting that they are based on existing commitments, the CRC. Then let's be concrete. Let's work on goals, targets, indicators, and a timeline. 3, last one, let's put aside our egos and our logos. This is really the moment where we forget for what organization we work for, and we put and unite our efforts. So we got together, and this is something that we brought also at the Civil Society Days of the GFMD in Dhaka, and this has developed into an initiative, the Initiative on Child Rights in the Global Compacts. I'm going to wave a few documents. You'd find them upstairs if you don't have them. Yeah, and I was going to show a green one first, you know. This one here, you have trade unions, you have UN agencies in there, but this is a civil society-led enterprise with the support of experts from UN agencies. Okay? We also have the private sector. And then this conference, 320 people we had, comes from this initiative. It's one part of it. A conference where we had everybody together, not enough governments, 10 governments, but we had the private sector, we had philanthropy, we had private sector, I said academics, diaspora, and not only child-focused organizations. Isn't it a pity that we're discussing here while the governments are just 2 kilometers away discussing the same things as us? Is that about hearing our voices? Eh? And this year, unfortunately, we have less representatives of governments here because of the overlap that we've had to manage. But tomorrow we would have the common space, and that's a key moment. But to come and really to introduce a second component of this initiative, which was very concretely to say, and that's what has been discussed before, what are the goals, targets, and indicators and a timeline that ideally we would like for children? Let's give it as an example. Let's give it a push. Let's give it a try to say that that could be the direction of the Global Compact. So in your welcome package, you have this document, which is a summary of what a number of experts, and amongst many of you are in the room here, from a number of organizations have worked on, but they didn't think about their organization. They put their energy as individuals. And then This is the longer version that you'd find upstairs and here and there, which details a little bit more what we mean by these goals, targets, and indicators. And we also give some examples. This could be a direction, and this is what we have now in hand for dialogue with governments. And this has to go down into capitals, into the countries, for us as a large movement to say, that's what we want for children in the global compacts, and that is something concrete.
Gracias, Ignacio.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. This is the time to decide what actions are we going to envisage, how are we going to set our proposals and our strategies for the Global Pact. We are going to ask Gibril to talk to us about the context for the Global Pact and Compact and see what actions can we write down as civil society.
Thank you very much, Berenice. And if you don't mind, just beyond context, if I can also perhaps make some comments on tactics and format. I think the context we've already heard from the earlier presentation. What the New York Declaration tells us as a guide to the compact is very clear. It's not a lot, but it's clear. It talks about actionable commitments, principles, and understandings. It says that the compact should be these three. That is actionable commitments, principles, and understandings. The one word there that is new and general is the one understandings. And that is the one that we need to take and interpret the way we want. But the words commitments are known, and the word principles are known. But that's the first context. The second context, as we've heard, that this will be a non-binding agreement. That's very likely. So let's just work on that basis. Third context is this compact and the New York Declaration are all happening within the early life of the Sustainable Development Goals. So that looms large when we discuss these things. The fourth observation about context is the convergence. In the packs that ICMC have circulated, there's an updated version of the convergent matrix, which shows civil society's 5-year, 8-point plan and how it links to the SDGs, New York Declaration, and others. And when you look at that, you see that the strategic case is made. Some of the big things we're interested in are already set out there, and generally we are agreed. This is why in the beginning of this whole compact process, I was a suspect. I was a skeptic. I didn't cross the line of being a cynic, but I was a skeptic. And my skepticism was, why would we have to, what else do we have to do? Because we've discussed these principles and these commitments for so long. Now, the convergence that exists now is what stops me being a cynic. In that you have governments and a whole range of civil society who almost every issue we are interested in, we can find one or more governments who's doing the right thing in that area. So there is hope, and I suppose the word Tumaini, here's our hope. Here's our Tumaini. Now, in terms of the tactics, what do we do now, from now to the compact? My observations, and these are my personal observations, although I've listened to what many of our colleagues have been talking about, is that almost every clause that should be in the compact should try to achieve a number of tactical, practical goals. And I've just listed 3 of them. Number 1, that every clause should seek to strengthen the existing coalition of the willing. Right now, on every topic, there's a coalition of the willing, few countries, civil society. So every clause should strengthen them. Number 2, every clause should seek to facilitate what I call the hyperactivity of the devoted. It is not enough that we have a coalition of the willing. Those, we need to allow them and give them the opportunity for them to do more. to move from being just willing to be devoted, so that the case that we're making that migration is a positive thing becomes the narrative rather than the counteractions that we have to do. The third point is that every clause of the compact, in my mind, should be worth having. One of the subtitles of this civil society is an agreement, a compact worth agreeing to. So we need to have a compact that is worth having, not just for member states, but for us, civil society, so that whether member states have it or not, we can use it, and in our own coalitions, in our own alliances, we try to implement it. And lastly, in terms of contact, I would say that every clause should seek to create a pluralist opportunity rather than a policy coherence. I think there's a risk, a danger, that we would be sidetracked to try to get policy coherence. Because as we've seen, we will be able to show so many examples of how things are not coherent. Sometimes one of our governments that we support, we think they're doing good things on one thing, are doing a bad thing on something else. I would suggest, for the purposes of the compact, let us not be distracted by seeking coherence there. Let's just seek plurality. That is, the good things we want to do are indeed there. I would say I had the opportunity to speak at that New York summit, and my main point was that perhaps we are over-principled and underperforming. And everything we need to do and we should worry about is performance. So the last part of my comments about format, should I go now or should I? Okay. Again, I've just put them in bullet points as to what I think the format is. If I imagine the compact finish and it is in a document, this is how I imagine it to look like. It would start with a simple preamble that is a single paragraph restating principles. Because I don't think it should be about principles. It should be a preamble stating all of the principles, making reference to all of the principles and conventions we agree with. Just acknowledge it and refer it. Immediately under it, it should now introduce a new principle. And that new principle, which I don't think exists in anything I've seen, should be a principle to say that the non-implementation of convention is an outrage and a shame for member states. That, I think, should be a new principle. That it is an outrage to agree something and not to do it as a new principle. That is as a closer to the principle, to recollecting what the principles are. And as Louis Haber was saying, these things may sound outrageous, but they may not be. It's only that you've heard it first time here. By this afternoon, it's not outrageous, and some member states will perhaps be prepared to agree. There are some countries who think it is outrageous to agree things and not implement it. Second point is that we should set a vision. The vision should again be not more than a paragraph, and this sort of brings us to Crepo's paper about taking a longer term view, but we've heard some of the comments made about the risk of just doing that, but we know enough to set a one paragraph vision of what we think human mobility and migration should be. And it wouldn't be too much far away from the phrases we now use, like migration as an opportunity, as a choice rather than necessity, and that migration is a driver for development. Something along those lines, we should be able to have a simple vision. The other point I would want to see in the format is then a small number of new principles. The first principle I mentioned about the outrage of non-implementation, that one is an addition to the first one. But there are new principles in migration that we think that may come from consultations. I can think of 3 or 4 examples. Number one, this bit about firewalls for delivery of services. Let's see whether it can go in as a global principle. Number 2, the idea of non-criminalization of solidarity. In the past 18 months, we are seeing the criminalization of solidarity. Civil society who are helping migrants are being treated as criminals. And that's a new threat, so there should be a principle on that. Number 3, as a new principle, a principle of regularization, to say that any child who's lived in a country for 5 years, irrespective of how they came to be irregular, should be regularized as a principle. One can extend that to adults as well. And then we can have a debate as to how many number of years it is, but as a principle. And last principle, as a new one, I think we should introduce, or at least put it for our negotiations, the concept of transnationality. That in the 21st century, we should be thinking of the principle of transnationality, that human beings may have more than one nationality, may live in more than one country, and there's nothing evil about it. Maybe we can lose on that, but let's have the argument on that, and perhaps the other points would get through. Apart from new principles, then we can also have, then the commitments. This area about commitments, my suggestion and my argument is we should divide it into 2. It should have commitments and it should have omissions. And that's a psychological point. Member states always talk about the things they commit to do. But we should have a section about omissions. That is the things we absolutely will not do. So a list of things that we absolutely will not do. And number 6 would then be to have something like Ignacio have already produced, that is on all the thematics. Right now, Global Compact has 6 thematics. As civil society, when we look at our matrix, we might end up agreeing those 6, or it may be 10 or 9, whatever. We agree those broad issues, and then we break them down, and I like what already Ignacio's done with children's rights, goals, targets, indicators, but we can put in there sort of program options. And then finally, I think it should have a very strong section on means of implementation. That is money. How much would it cost to implement it? And this also is not an outrage, because in the New York Declaration, there's a clause there saying that the compact may include means of implementation. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Gibril.
Thank you very much I think you're the first person I listen to who gives us a clear idea on what could the Global Pact be. And that sheds light on what we want to build it. And now we give the floor to Michele, who's going to talk to us about what will be those impacts that will be on the global pact. And Michele has participated in different networks towards this global compact.
To follow Gibril, not only because we were co-chairing a couple years ago, but I also think you must be shadow writing this compact for the governments, because as Betty said, it's a very thorough picture of what we actually could achieve in a compact. And as Betty said, I don't know if any of us have heard it so far in that very structured manner, so I think we've all taken detailed notes. I just want to give some brief comments that might help us, hopefully, in the working sessions today, because I think that's kind of where we're going to next, and I know we're kind of over time as well, so I'll try and make this brief. But first, before just saying 3 brief points, I wanted to thank Blanca and all of the Central Americans and the Mexicans for coming here, for Blanca's courage, because I think that it's very rare for us to actually hear the anguish that migrant families face on a personal level. And many of us in the room are parents. And I think that we can all relate to what she has gone through, what the committee is going through. And I think we have to find ways that we are not just kind of informing ourselves, but that we also bring this into other spaces. And I think that we are starting to do this now in testimonies, and I think in civil society we have done this in written form over the years by monitoring migrant deaths. And this monitoring has been elevated by IOM's Missing Migrants project, which covers part of it. But I think it's only through our persistence and our courage as individuals suffering this and as people in solidarity with those suffering it to bring this to the forefront that we can ever hope to, in some years, try to find ways that this doesn't happen to parents and to family members. So I really wanted to thank them for their courage in coming before us, which is extremely difficult, and to think together how to continue to do this. And I also wanted to just start off with recognizing the courage of one of the youth that Ignacio referred to, Mariana, who spoke last night from Brazil at the Brandenburg Gate about her own experience of being detained as a child and being returned from the United States, being separated from her family. And that's actually where I wanted to start off, because she told us then that children should never be detained. She told us what healthcare professionals, what human rights bodies have been telling us for years, that detention has a very negative impact on children's health, mental and physical, and well-being. She told us to that in her own voice. And this is where I wanted to start with the 3 brief points about the compact. So the first one, we've heard it on the first panel, is that we have to reiterate, in a sense, commitments, but we have to go beyond them. And the reason why I wanted to start with children in detention is just so that we collectively realize how we're coming along on this issue. 5 years ago, there was no global consensus that children should never be detained. And the global consensus is not at all from the governments. The global consensus that we have today is from the human rights partners. There have been about 10 UN and regional human rights actors that have all recommended never to detain children. It's never in their best interest, and it's always a child rights violation. But we didn't even have that 5 years ago. So we've now come across 5 years through a coalition to get this achievement. Now, how do we move forward? How do we actually go beyond kind of the commitments to start looking at, in practice, how do we get the things in place? And so this, what Ignacio referred to, this Child Rights in the Global Compact, this is a 4-pager. This is a very interesting resource that I think could be looked at in some of the working sessions, not only in children, but because it's actually mapped out what are some of the goals and what are some of the targets. And so, for example, on children in detention, it gives, by 2021, we should have gathered more information about alternatives. By 2023, we should change legislation. There's other ones as well on access to services. For example, by 2025, ensure that refugee and migrant children have access on the same level as national children to immunization schemes and pediatric care, so health care. So I just gave those examples because we know, for example, in the European context, there are still 28 member states, so I'm talking about 28. But of the 28, 8 EU member states already give undocumented children by law this goal. So they're already, by law, enabling undocumented children the same level of healthcare access as national children. Practice is another issue that we all know about. But how can we move forward? What do we need to move forward to actually, and what has helped moving forward in changing the law in some of those 8 states? The second point, so going beyond commitments, the second point that's also been raised this morning is we have to be visionary enough, but also specific enough and measurable enough. And the one example I wanted to give here is on the firewall. So we know that the firewall, this separation between immigration enforcement and services and justice, so that a health professional or teacher or labor inspector isn't required to report undocumented to the authorities, that's the firewall. What does this mean in practice? We know for the individual it means that they won't be perhaps deported. It means for the service providers they can actually do their job. But this is a very pragmatic, it could be a policy document. It doesn't have to be a law change per se, but it makes a huge, huge impact on the daily lives of both the migrants as well as the whole broader community. And the way to also start looking at something like the firewall is to involve cities. So 2 days ago there was the mayoral forum that a number of us participated in. And last year, there was this document, which I think has been brought here. This is a global consultation on what civil society has said about cities and on migrants and how we work together. And what I found interesting at the mayoral forum this year is that the firewall also came up in their statement, in their declaration as mayors. So we see that cities are part of the way forward in working to implement this. And maybe as Colin mentioned earlier about these civil society meetings from now until the end of October, we can find ways in our regional and national meetings to also involve them in the discussions. And the last point that I wanted to briefly make is the bigger question about the regular migration channels and how we also bridge the gap between the two compacts, so between our migration compact and the refugee compact. And I think Gregory Manieres was saying on the panel that we need to reach out, or the refugee rights organizations need to reach out more at the global level. We were doing that, I think, quite well until last year, September. And then when we separated into two compacts, we are very segmented. I would also say that I know many of us work on the national and regional levels quite well with refugee rights organizations, but we need to translate that to the global compacts level because we know the reality on the ground. In the European Union, there have been massive arrivals and a lot of people asking for asylum. The asylum recognition rate in the EU is not 100%. It's quite high, maybe almost near 50%, but it's not 100%. The return rate in the EU is also not 100%. It most likely never will be. So we know there will be people who are undocumented that fall between the gaps of both compacts. So we have to look at both together. Thanks.
Muchas gracias, Michele.
Thank you very much, Michele.
Pues ha sido un panel.
It's been a very interesting panel session. This shed light, and we now have a clear idea on how we want to work and launch our recommendations towards the pact. We are now going to give the floor to the members of the audience. Please be specific. There's a question there at the back.
Por favor. Dos, tres.
Hello, Zaina Muhanna from Amal Association from Lebanon. Thank you so much for very interesting interventions, and I do really salute the participatory process of the Global Compact because we're talking about fieldwork, and I think whenever we're integrating lessons learned, best practices, this is the best way of having conventions that are realistic for implementation. I'd like just to stress that definitely since the World Humanitarian Summit, we're speaking about a changing demography in the world, increasing refugees, increasing migration, and that really we should do something about it. It's true. There are lots of migration, but we know that there is a big distinction between voluntary migration and involuntary migration, where people really have to move because of crisis and wars and conflict. And in other places, other people are leaving to find better conditions of living. So this distinction, we really see it in the field whenever we're responding, because each has different factors for its initiation, and the response also needs to be dealt really differently by governments and others. I'd like to give the case of Lebanon, for example. We know the Syrian crisis has been there, and it's the biggest crisis since Rwanda '94 in terms of magnitude of refugees, of time, of scope, of displacement. Lebanon, whose 4 million population, accommodated so far more than 1.5 million, so 1/3 of our population is Syrian refugees. We have 7% migrant domestic workers and previous Iraqi and other refugees, so almost 40% of our population. And really here the question comes of what is the equal responsibility for the response of migration? How much developing versus developed countries should bear the responsibility of the support in a time where infrastructure sometimes does not support? So definitely the human cause is at its, so solidarity component is there. Another issue that we see, which is really, I would recommend to have it in the Global Compact, is that as civil society, we know that change happens on the long term. It doesn't happen on the short term. And definitely things can't happen tomorrow. So that's why, and we know that many migrants don't leave because of choice, because of necessity. A woman who has 2 years old who leaves for money is not a voluntary or a positive migration. So the issue is about prevention. How much we, in the Global Compact, we should stress the issue of prevention. How much donors should allocate money for governance, decreasing corruption in countries of origin, in addressing the root causes of migration, and in parallel, how much are we allocating in the response? So the prevention component of migration, we believe, is really key, and that brings more effectiveness and better adequate conditions of living and support for humanity. Thank you.
Gracias. Tenemos 10
Thank you. We have 10 minutes, so I ask you, please, to be specific.
Adelante, por favor.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thanks to the presenters. My name is Dennis Signolo from Education International, also representing global unions. So first of all, concerning the non-binding nature of the Global Compact, I know that some people view that as an advantage. It's a huge disadvantage, nothing to cherish at all. We have observed in our negotiations in intergovernmental processes that governments are increasingly moving away from binding instruments. This is a fact. Of course, they will cite sovereignty, they will cite other factors like, oh, we have domestic legislation that covers that particular aspect adequately, so there is no need for an international convention on that. But unfortunately, the net effect of that is that nothing will be done, if at all. So there will be examples, of course, of committed states that lead by example. So that's a problem. Why is that a problem? Because we have, at the moment, binding UN conventions, covenants, ILO conventions, for example, very robust. The problem is that they've not been implemented and they've not been adopted in some cases, and they're not being implemented. So it's important to check why they have not been ratified, why they're not implemented. That's where the gap is. So the Global Compact must address the gap between the existing instruments and actual implementation on the ground. Then we'll make a difference for the world. The second point I want to raise is that there is need for robust monitoring, a robust monitoring and accountability mechanism. That's very important. You can have a very good instrument. If there is no monitoring, then nothing will happen. It might involve, for example, the ILO example of committees of experts where they review whether instruments are being reviewed and they write reports. That should be part of the deal. Finally, it's important that in terms of content, you talked, Gibril, very well about perhaps the different sections and so on. The content is fundamental. The content must address, for example, labor issues. The vast majority of people move because of employment. The content must address the right to public services, to health, to education, and so on. So during the 2 or maybe 3 days, including common space, let's also address the issue of content.
Gracias. Una participación.
Thank you. One, please, the lady there. Yes, please.
Y vamos a tener una más. Les pido que sean.
And one more. I ask you to please be specific.
Entonces, compañera, y allá. Concretos, por favor.
Specific, please.
My name is Christabel Peary from Southern Africa Trust. Just 2 quick points. I think one is on education among young people. I think particularly when you look at the African context, to really share with young people that the dream that they're having in more developed countries, the situation there, that education is not being provided to young people. And that's why there's this whole desire to say, obviously, my going into a European country or going to the States will provide this a new life and everything there is working out, but that's not where the situation is. I think we need to provide more awareness and people who've returned from these countries to then talk to young people within families, within communities, and say that what you are thinking is happening in those countries is not really the situation. I think it will prevent, and limit some of the young people moving. And then the situation of conflicts, especially in Africa, like the conflicts keep on happening and people are looking for better livelihoods. And when you look at countries, for example, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, and you look just over 2 days ago, about 10,000 people were moving because of conflict, because of violence. And people are moving from one country to another and looking for better livelihoods. As long as conflicts continue to happen, and when you look at some of these conflicts, you have to look at what have been the drivers to these conflicts. And certain countries that have been involved in some of these conflicts behind the scenes, we need to address some of those issues and then limit, obviously, the movement of people and what can we provide in terms of alternatives. Thanks.
Gracias. Vamos a cambiar un poco.
Thank you. We are going to go to this part of the room.
Ahorita vamos a regresar porque no.
We'll go back to that other side of the room. Just 1 minute.
Okay. Again, from the outreach conferences and our friends from friends and colleagues from Budapest, it's a reflections that they want to share with all of you. The experience and successful negotiation in child protection can be used in other fields to help stakeholders to come together and obtain a feeling of success. This is one instance in Hungary that has managed to gather the governmental actors and CSOs on child protection issues. So basically the point is that the Hungarian context, there is little communication on dialogue between the government and civil society actors, whereas child protection related issues have tended to be more successful in bringing together these actors around the table.
Gracias. Aquí y allá. Regresamos.
Thank you. Here and here. My name is Roberto Bravo. I represent the Californian community. I would like to propose, if you know, well, you probably know that we have an important problem in the United States with the current president, Donald Trump. He is against immigration. How? For instance, why the state of California, where our governor is supporting the migrant community, and they are even proposing that California becomes independent to the United States, given the support to the migrant community. Why shouldn't we invite a representative from the U.S., or rather from the Californian government, so that we can have the views of why migrants are important in the U.S.? Thank you. The last intervention.
I think that the proposal that Gibril made earlier is very, very interesting, but it needs to be turned into concrete reality. When you talk about objectives, when you talk about principles, we need to turn that into something concrete by, I don't know, adopting motions, for example. When we talk about human rights, when we talk about the causes of some problems, we need to absolutely translate that into action. In 2007 and 2008, we said migration is the result of development, or migration is the result of the non-respect of human rights. I think these are things that need to be turned into concrete action. And I think civil society organizations, if we want to remain credible towards the victims, need to speak to government, need to send a clear message to government. And that's how we will be credible. There are people that are dying every day when they try to cross from Africa to Europe. There are people who die because of climate change. There are people who die because of conflicts and wars. We need to be able to be the voice of those people, speak out and express, ourselves on their behalf, because they can't. We need member states and governments to listen to us. And that is how we can be credible, and that is how we can eventually come up with some sort of practical and practically implementable projects. And that is also how we will be actively fighting populism and xenophobic trends. If we don't have a voice, and if that voice does not convey a message, then we're dead. We can't fall into the trap of being what I would call the fireman for governments. No, we need to be the spokesperson of the people we represent. We need to be able to have a clear message and base that message on human rights, development, and the respect for human life.
Thank you very much. We cannot have more questions because we need to close. We are going to have some final comments by our panelists. I regret this, but just a few comments to conclude from our panelists.
Just two brief points on what Dennis from Education International rightly referred to about the fact that it's been repeatedly told to us that it will be non-binding. But as you had mentioned, what about the fact that we have all these binding instruments? And I was just reading from my own notes of a roundtable that Louise Arbour gave in Brussels last week on the compacts for civil society there. And she was saying, and it's a shame she's not here, so maybe we can also confirm this with her again afterwards, that when she was also envisaging, kind of as Gibril did, how the opening could be, she said that it could be a restatement of existing instruments as a starting point, that there is nothing new, and that would in itself already be a helpful contribution. She was referring to the ILO conventions, the international human rights frameworks, and so I think that we should also then kind of investigate this more in depth. How much can we ensure that this opening refers to what's already existing? And even if the whole thing itself is non-binding. And the other very brief point is on kind of our terms, and I think the colleague from Lebanon was talking about, I just wanted to mention this here for also reflection, for us going forward, because I think there's a lot of challenge about the whole notion of migration being voluntary, because we increasingly hear about all of these human rights violations that are not conflict related, that also are pushing people to move, and who would never be considered people who would have protection under the refugee framework. And I increasingly hear in the European context economic migrants. Is there ever one reason that anyone is moving? Is it easy to put it down to one reason? And so that's why I just say this more for reflection and challenging from ourselves. Do we want to also use this simple dichotomy? Is it voluntary or involuntary? Or do we want to look at why people are moving and which frameworks can they actually get protection under? And where are the gaps in those?
The one thing that encourages me is all of us seem to agree that we want something practical and about implementation. So for us, effectively, our work towards the compact to achieve that practicality can start this afternoon in the working sessions. So these things we are thinking about, let's do it. Let's get those wording, focusing on practicality, on implementation, and covering the gaps, as it were. It's the comments made by a colleague from Lebanon and South Africa. Just to mention, this is why it's been important to make the link between the Migration Compact and the Refugee Compact, because the Refugee Compact, the priorities, the four main things are, number one, increase legal resettlement. Number two is to reduce the pressure in host countries, the countries that host refugees. Number three is to address conditions to allow voluntary return. And the other one is to promote self-reliance of refugees. So there's a lot of overlap there. And when we start today and finish on Saturday, there are also national, regional, and thematic consultations, as Colin told us, and that is it. And these compacts, these negotiations, in a way, they are run by those who turn up. So if we don't turn up, we're not there. And if we don't put in our wording, we're not there.
Yeah, bubbles, links, and urgency. Bubbles, we live in bubbles. So how can we link to other areas? Just give you an example. Kathmandu, We for Change, is following this conversation. It's a group of youth. You know, I do a TED talk and really put a lot of effort in it, and then apart from my children and my neighbors, there are hardly any clicks. They do a social clip. In 2 weeks, they get 270,000 clicks. Okay? So we have to think in the way we are communicating and breaking these bubbles. Invest in youth. Movements. We have to open up to other movements, other social movements. They are perhaps not migration movements, but they want a harmonious and peaceful society. We have to work with them. We have to become bigger. Links. Link with the Global Compact on refugees. Yes. This morning, 9 o'clock, there was a side event, Palais des Nations, at the Standing Committee of the UNHCR, doing just the same as this, presenting what we want for children in the Global Compact with S, because a child is a child, no matter migration status. So this also includes the internally displaced children. We have to find those links with the Global Compact on refugees. And then the third one, urgency. Let's move. I mean, the consultation phase is over. It ends in November. There are so many consultations going on. Are we going to be able to follow them? We should have out there clear messages of what civil society has to support in these different consultations. We have to increase this movement and take the space. It's not about who is speaking, it's about what you're saying and with the legitimacy. And this Civil Society Days is a clear moment to be able to come out with things that have legitimacy and that can be used by many, many of our constituencies. Things happen at national level, not only at Geneva and New York. 6 months to go for the consultation phase.
Muchas gracias al...
Thank you to our panelists. They have given us a lot of information. We have just begun and we will keep on working in the working sessions. Now we're going to go for lunch. Just a few minutes for the practical informations. A round of applause for our panelists.